Hello and welcome to this week's class notes about Mrs. Dalloway. This week I want to focus on just emphasizing some key elements of the historical and cultural context to really help us place this novel. And some of this is material that is covered in the textbook, some of it isn't, but I wanted to really sort of draw your attention to what I think are really some key ideas, key moments, key histories that help us really understand British literature in the early 20th century. So with that in mind, I actually want to turn back the clock a little bit, back to the Victorian period, because I really think that what we see happening in the Victorian age really helps us understand what's happening in the first decades of the 20th century. So first, a quick review of the 19th century. During the 19th century, Victorian England experienced great change in spite of the image of the Victorians as stuffy and conservative, and of the Victorian era as largely repressed. And this is something that we read about when we read The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the historical context that went along with that. So England was the first nation to undergo an industrial revolution, and this reality, during which time England changed from an agrarian-based society to an industrial one, had sweeping ramifications on English society, from the class system to the organization of England's rural and urban spaces, to England standing in the global geopolitical order. During the century, England vastly expanded and organized its empire to encompass territories around the globe and secure its economic and political power. Within the geographic borders of the United Kingdom, England maintained a colonial stance towards Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. These relationships, especially with Ireland, became increasingly strained during the course of the century, and I'll return specifically to the Irish situation shortly. So the 19th century in literature, among these changes, literacy rates rose sharply during the century, and the publishing industry vastly expanded. Especially noteworthy was the popularization of the novel as a form of entertainment and enlightenment. And again, this is something that you read extensively about, and the novel that we read last week, or the novella, really is an example of that. It's by the point that was published in the 1880s, the novel had really become kind of a mainstay of culture, in the same way that today we would think of television or film as the primary medium of storytelling. Novels were that for people living in Victorian England. So we have writers such as Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, Sir Walter Scott, and of course Robert Louis Stevenson, publishing novels that are being read by a lot of people, that are having a big impact on the culture, that are trying to reflect back that culture and different aspects of British society. So with the expansion of literacy and publishing came an increasing division in writing between highbrow, middlebrow, and lowbrow that implied various purposes for writing, and also implied the class levels of the intended audiences for what was being written. So when we get to the end of the Victorian period, what's called the fin de siècle, so we're basically in that 1890s, end of the century moment, and going then into the first decade of the 20th. At the end of the 19th century, a number of writers, like Oscar Wilde, who's pictured here, challenged the conventional wisdom of Victorian culture and dared to experiment with new literary forms as they confronted the end of an era in English history with the aging Queen Victoria, who had reigned for decades, and the daunting reality of a new century. These writers paved the way for a new group of writers and artists who emerged during the 1890s and early 1900s, and who sought to represent in new and innovative ways the incredible, wondrous, and sometimes frightening realities of a new century. Writers like Wilde also valued art for art's sake, and viewed the aesthetic value of writing as in and of itself valuable, as opposed to seeing literature as playing primarily a social, political, or moral function. So in other words, you have two major things going on here. One is that writers are starting to look around them and say, look, we're living in a very different world than people were 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago. Our literature should reflect that. We're living in an age of great change, of transformation, of new ideas, and our writing should reflect that. And there's also these new ideas about what the purpose is of art. Is art meant to instruct us? Is art meant to give us pleasure? Is art meant to make us sympathize better with other people's points of view. What is the purpose of literature? So you see that also being debated and thought about in fresh ways during this period. So the first decade of the 20th century was a time of transition that ultimately led to the full flowering of modernist manifestos and undertakings, often in the spirit of Ezra Pound's slogan, to make it new. So this goes with this idea of sort of, okay, we've got this long history of literature behind us. That's what in this class we've been studying all along. But how do you create something that's new, that's never been done before? There are a lot of experiments being done with poetry, with drama, with fiction. And people that were writing these modernist manifestos, so they were sort of spelling out in writing, look, here are our ideas about what art and writing should do. And some of these ideas were really revolutionary. Now, I want to return again to the idea of the British Empire, because this is one of those important contexts that's going to help us understand Mrs. Dalloway and what's happening during this period. So as we've talked about already, the British Empire at the start of the 20th century was the largest empire in the history of the planet. It contained territories in Africa, Asia, the Americas, Australia, the South Pacific, the Caribbean, and the Middle East, as well as the member nations of the United Kingdom, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. So by the start of World War I, the empire stretched across almost a quarter of the Earth's land surface and contained more than a quarter of the Earth's population. So this is one of those facts that you hear a lot about regarding the empire, and it's something that you really need to let soak in. I mean, when you really think about what that means, it's a staggering fact, one that would shape everything about what it would like to be a British citizen, to live in that world, right? I mean, this is incredible. So this reality had a profound impact on British society, on the meaning of British and English identity, and therefore on the writers whose work we'll be studying. And so this week we'll talk about, and as we're ending the semester, we'll talk about, in Mrs. Dalloway, do we see aspects of this in Virginia Woolf's novel? And I think that we will. So this empire was run and regulated through an enormously complex and often contradictory set of policies and practices that ranged widely from place to place. In some countries, British rule involved direct military presence and the plundering of bodies, land, and resources. In many, it required a population of middlemen, officials promoted from the native population to represent British interests and act as intermediaries between British power and the natives. In some, British rule was a form of unofficial power exerted through diplomatic and economic pressure and advantages provided to the partner nation. And here's a map of the geography of the British Empire in the 1920s. You can see all those red areas are all part of that empire. If you'll note up here, you'll see entire continents, right? Australia, here's all of Canada, right? Over here you have parts of the Caribbean, South America, large swaths of Africa. Here's the Indian Empire right here. You've got parts of the Middle East. Obviously, here's the United Kingdom right there. Of all the territories that made up the British Empire, from Commonwealth settler nations like Canada and Australia, to colonies where the British presence was necessary to enforce the rule of British law, the crown jewel of the empire was India. And we're going to see that a major character in Mrs. Dalloway has actually just returned from India. Imperial rule required not just a political, economic, and military infrastructure, but also the influence of culture in all its forms. So schools that were built in the colonies that operated on English principles, missionaries who worked to spread Christianity, the dissemination of English images, poems, books, and values. The Irish question. So I said I would return to this. It really is an important and unique colonial situation that I want to emphasize here. So many factions within Ireland had been arguing and fighting for Irish independence during the 19th century, and the urgency of the struggle only increased into the 20th century. There was much debate about what Irish culture was, what role England should play in Irish affairs. Irish writers and artists, especially William Butler Yeats, who's pictured there to the left, were major voices in these contentious and consequential conversations. The Irish Revival is the name we give to this intensification of Irish artistic output during this time. Women and men. At the start of the century, women were increasingly speaking out for expanded rights, including the right to vote and to own property. The woman question which had been central to Victorian debates in the second half of the 19th century, in some ways became an ever more urgent and omnipresent issue in British culture during the first couple of decades of the century. Although women's rights made some real advances during the early decades of the century, such as the right to vote, homosexual acts were still illegal, and so gay men and lesbian women, including a number of well-known writers, were forced, by and large, to live mostly closeted lives. And we'll see these issues related to gender and sexual identity, again, thematized in Mrs. Dalloway, in the character of Mrs. Dalloway and other characters, and we'll see that these are also major themes that ran through the life of Virginia Woolf. Obviously, as a woman writer, she was uniquely situated to write about some of these issues. And so we're going to talk a lot about that in the coming couple of weeks. Technology and commerce. So a major legacy of the Industrial Revolution was a strong economy in England. An economy which was, of course, underwritten by the empire and the myriad benefits of the colonies to the prosperity of the mother country. We saw that a few weeks ago when we read the interesting narrative of Equiano, right? And we read about his slave narrative and what it, and sort of the point of view from someone who had been captured as a slave and then had eventually bought his own freedom, but who was looking at the sort of the underbelly, the dark underbelly of what the British Empire really looked like. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, a number of technological innovations started to transform life in England, including the railway system, mining technologies, advances in weaponry, and the inventions of the phonograph, the automobile, the airplane, and mass production. The spread of electricity and the rise of cinema and the radio further wrought changes in the daily fabric of day-to-day life in Britain. We'll see some of these innovations actually make themselves known in Mrs. Dalloway. We'll see them represented in there, and it'll be interesting for us to observe how characters in that book respond to these technologies. So we also have transforming ideas. So several major developments in thought, philosophy, and science created seismic shifts in British society and around the globe. So Sigmund Freud's theories of the self and the unconscious radically destabilized previous theories of a coherent self that was fully in control. We really see these ideas play out in Mrs. Dalloway. Now it was possible to conceive of each person as a complex inner universe of anxieties, contradictions, fears, and desires. Freud's seminal book, Interpretation of Dreams, was published right at the start of the century in 1900 and powerfully affected many of the writers we associate with modernism. And there you have a sort of visual representation of the conscious, the unconscious, and then the superego, the ego, and the id. In anthropology, James Fraser introduced in The Golden Bough, first published in 1890, the concept of viewing all cultures comparatively, and thus reframed how people thought about Western society and religion. His work challenged his readers to think in terms of Christianity as being on equal footing with other forms of religion and myth. Thus, for some, Christianity becomes one among many belief systems rather than the one true religion. Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophies, like Freud and Fraser, profoundly influenced a number of modernist writers with his ideas about a godless universe and stoic laughter in the face of their tragic inability to create change. He also argued for a reevaluation of all values and the concept of supermen, who must forge their own path because they were unbound by conventional morality. So let's look for some of these ideas playing out in Mrs. Dalloway, maybe voiced by some of the characters in there. In 1900, Max Planck proposed his quantum theory and revolutionized our understanding of the subatomic world. Albert Einstein, 5 years later, published his special theory of relativity, a theory that upended what had been up to that point commonly accepted scientific concepts of space and time, mass and energy. As Einstein discovered, there was no ideal, stable position from which anyone could transparently and accurately view reality. So these are major, major scientific shifts, ones that really forever altered our understanding of the role of science and also the operation of the physical universe. So taken together, along with other advances in the sciences and physics in particular, these breakthroughs led to a much more elastic, unstable, and uncertain conception of the physical world and humans' place in that world. And another theme that we can look at in Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway is representations of space and time, and how Woolf represents the passage of time and each human's relationship to the passing of time in particular. Literacy and the role of the artist. So many forms of writing were being published during the first decade of the 20th century, first decades, from newspapers to magazines to novels to travel memoirs. Some writers, those writing with serious intent, framed their role as guiding and even creating meaning in a world they saw as growing fractured, alienated, and lost. These writers, who we call modernists, sought to make it new. The it here standing in for art, but also culture, expression, ways of seeing and being in the world. So writers like T.S. Eliot and James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. So Virginia Woolf is one of these writers, and her novel, Mrs. Dalloway, will stand in as a representative of modernism and of the distance we have traveled from the start of the semester in Beowulf. So with that said, obviously be reading a lot more about this if you haven't already from our textbook. But again, I just wanted to frame some major ideas. There's so much more that can be said about all of this, but at least it'll give you kind of a basic understanding of what's happening at the time. And we'll explore it more fully through the readings that I've assigned from the textbook this week.